In the early 14th century, a Dominican friar and theologian was put on trial by the Pope. He had been preaching in the vernacular in German to ordinary people in the churches and marketplaces of the Rhineland about the nature of God and the self and the relationship between them. He had been saying things that the church found alarming, not heretical in the obvious sense, not a rejection of doctrine, something more unsettling than rejection. A reinterpretation so radical, so interior, so insistent on the direct and unmediated encounter between the individual soul and the ground of all being, that it left the institutional church with an uncomfortable question. If what this man is saying is true, what exactly is the institution for? He said this: "The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love." He said this: God is not found in the soul by adding anything, but by a process of subtraction. He said this: if the only prayer you ever say in your entire life is thank you, that will be sufficient. And then, most provocatively of all, he said this: I pray God to rid me of God. He was not being flippant. He was not being provocative for its own sake. He was making the most demanding philosophical and spiritual argument available in the medieval Christian tradition, the argument that the God most people are seeking is not the God that is actually there. That the God of the doctrine and the institution and the carefully constructed theology is a concept, a human production, an image of the divine that the human mind has made, and that the human mind must eventually release, must let go of entirely before the encounter with what the concept was always pointing at can occur. His name was Meister Eckhart. He was one of the most radical thinkers the medieval church produced. And what he understood about the relationship between the self and the ultimate, about what it means to stop seeking and start being, to stop acquiring and start releasing, to let go of the very thing you have been building your spiritual life around, is what every tradition that has gone deep enough has eventually arrived at, and what the present moment, with its particular hunger for the authentic and its particular talent for producing the performance of the authentic instead, needs more than almost any other teaching available. There is a specific exhaustion that arrives for many people somewhere in the middle of a life that has been organized around seeking, not the exhaustion of failure, the exhaustion of a certain kind of success. The person who has done the right things has built the practice, accumulated the achievements, constructed the identity, done the work, and who finds in the quiet moments when the doing pauses that the thing they were building toward has not quite arrived. That the self they have assembled, for all its careful construction, does not feel like the self they were looking for. That there is a gap between the version of themselves they can present to the world and the version they encounter in the silence when the presenting stops. We live in a culture that is very good at the acquisition of selves. The credentials, the practices, the identities carefully assembled from the available materials of the age, the spiritual seeker, the mindful professional, the person who has done the work, who meditates and reads and attends the retreats and has the vocabulary for the things they are trying to find. There is nothing wrong with any of this. Eckhart would not say there is anything wrong with it. He would say it is a beginning. And he would say, with the patience and the precision of a man who had done all of it himself, who had studied theology for decades and built the most rigorous philosophical framework available to the 14th century, that the beginning eventually reaches a place where the only movement forward is a movement that feels, to the self that has been doing the acquiring, exactly like retreat, the letting go, not of the practice, not of the commitment, not of the genuine orientation toward what matters. The letting go of the self that has been doing the seeking, the releasing of the image of the divine that the seeking has constructed, the willingness, which Eckhart spent his life arguing was the hardest and the most necessary thing, to release even the God you have been seeking, so that what was always behind the image can finally, in the emptiness the releasing creates, be encountered directly. He called it Gelassenheit, releasement. The specific, active, deeply demanding practice of releasing the grasping self, the self that accumulates, constructs, seeks, achieves, and allowing the ground of being that was always present to become present in a way the grasping self had been, with all its activity inadvertently blocking. Meister Eckhart was born around 1260 in Hochheim, in the Thuringia region of what is now Germany. His birth name was Eckhart von Hochheim. He entered the Dominican order as a young man and received the most rigorous philosophical and theological education available in medieval Europe, studying in Cologne under Albertus Magnus's successors, completing a master's degree in theology at the University of Paris, the intellectual center of the medieval world. He became a significant figure in the Dominican order, prior of Erfurt, vicar of Thuringia, eventually provincial of Saxony. He lectured at Paris twice, a distinction reserved for the most eminent theologians of the age. He administered, taught, preached, wrote. He was, by every institutional measure, a successful and respected churchman, and he preached. The sermons are what survive most completely, and they are extraordinary not in the decorative sense, not as literary objects, but as philosophy. Dense, precise, entirely demanding philosophy delivered to ordinary people in the language they actually spoke, addressing the question that Eckhart apparently could not stop returning to across the full span of his career. What is the soul? What is God? And what is the relationship between them when you have stripped away every concept, every image, every doctrinal formulation, every institutional mediation, when you have let go of everything the tradition has told you about them and stood in the nakedness of the direct encounter? His answer, developed across decades of preaching and teaching and writing, was what the trial was about. The soul, he said, has a ground, a spark. He called it a little castle, a desert that is, in its deepest nature, identical with the ground of God, not similar, not in relationship with, identical. The ground of the soul and the ground of God are one ground, and the entire spiritual life, the prayer, the practice, the study, the asceticism, the seeking, has only one purpose: to clear away everything that prevents the soul from knowing what it already, most fundamentally, is. This is the paradox at the center of Eckhart's teaching, and it is the paradox that made the inquisitors nervous. If the soul is already at its ground, one with God, if the encounter with the divine is not a destination to be reached but a reality to be recognized, then the institution that positions itself as the necessary mediator between the soul and God is, in the deepest sense, structurally unnecessary. Not harmful, not to be rejected, but not the point. The point is the ground. The encounter, the recognition, and the institutional apparatus, however useful, however genuinely valuable in the life of the ordinary Christian, cannot itself produce the thing it is pointing toward. Only the releasing can do that. He was charged with heresy in 1326 when he was in his mid-60s. He defended himself with considerable skill, appealing to the Pope and submitting detailed theological explanations of each condemned proposition. He died in 1328, probably in Avignon, before the papal bull condemning 28 of his propositions was issued. The condemnation declared that he had spread tares among the wheat of the simple people. He was dead before he could respond to it. His works were suppressed for centuries. They circulated in manuscript, covertly, among the communities of Rhineland mystics he had influenced: Tauler, Suso, the Beguines, the Friends of God. They were rediscovered by German Romantic philosophers in the 19th century and have been in continuous circulation since. They influenced Hegel and Schopenhauer and later Heidegger. They influenced the Zen scholar D.T. Suzuki, who found in Eckhart's teaching a parallel to Zen so precise that he spent years writing about it. They influenced Thomas Merton and every serious Western engagement with contemplative practice in the 20th century. The tares among the wheat of the simple people have proven remarkably durable. What is Eckhart actually saying? Because the language he uses, the spark of the soul, the ground of God, the desert of the Godhead, is the language of the medieval mystical tradition, and it requires translation before it becomes available to the person who did not grow up inside that tradition. Here is the translation. Most people, most of the time, relate to the deepest things, to God, to meaning, to the ground of their own existence through concepts. through the images and doctrines and frameworks and identities that the culture, the tradition, the institution, the practice has provided. These concepts are not nothing. They are necessary. They are the scaffolding by which the human mind approaches what it cannot directly apprehend. They are the beginning of the journey, but they are not the destination. And the person who mistakes the scaffolding for the building, who takes the concept of God for God, who takes the spiritual identity for the spiritual reality, who takes the practice for the encounter the practice was always pointing toward, has stopped at the threshold without passing through it. Eckhart's instruction is to pass through, to release the concept, not to become an atheist, not to abandon the tradition. He was a Dominican friar to the end of his life. To hold the concept lightly enough that it can be set down. To approach the ground of being directly, in the nakedness of the self that has stopped acquiring, stopped constructing, stopped seeking, in the silence that Eckhart called the desert of the Godhead, and to discover there what the concepts were always approximating but could never fully reach. And what is there? This is where Eckhart is most careful and most difficult and most honest. He does not give a description that can be added to the seeker's collection of descriptions. He gives instructions for arriving at the place where description runs out. What is there, he says, is not a what. It is the ground itself, the ground of the soul and the ground of God recognized as one ground. Not two things in relationship, one thing in recognition of itself. And the recognition, when it comes, is not an experience that happens to a self. It is what remains when the self that was seeking has been thoroughly enough released. This is what I pray God to rid me of God means. The God I have constructed, the image, the concept, the carefully assembled theology, must be released before the reality the image was pointing at can be directly encountered. Not because the image was wrong, because it was always an approximation of something that cannot be approximated, that can only be met. And the meeting requires the emptying that Eckhart spent his whole life describing and that the inquisitors found alarming, and that every tradition that has gone deep enough has eventually, in its own language, arrived at as the final instruction. Let go, not of the commitment, not of the love, not of the orientation toward what matters most, of the self that has been doing the holding, of the God that the holding has produced, of the concept that was the beginning of the journey and is not the end of it. Now the bridge. Because Eckhart was a 14th century Dominican theologian writing within the specific framework of medieval Christian mysticism, and most people watching this video are not medieval Dominican theologians. But here is what translates directly into every life. The identity you have built around your seeking, the version of yourself that you present to the world as the person who has the practice, the vocabulary, the spiritual framework is a form of the scaffolding Eckhart is describing. It is not nothing. It was necessary. It may have brought you to exactly the place you needed to be. But there comes a point, in every genuine interior life, when the identity of the seeker becomes the thing that is standing between the seeker and what they are seeking. The professional identity that has become so thoroughly who you are that you cannot imagine the self beneath it. The spiritual practice that has become a performance of spiritual development rather than a vehicle for it. The set of beliefs that you hold with such certainty that the holding has closed off the inquiry that produced them. The achievement that you have organized your self-worth around so completely that the releasing of it feels indistinguishable from the releasing of yourself. Eckhart is not asking you to abandon any of these. He is asking you to hold them lightly enough to release them, to carry them as instruments rather than identities. To know the difference between the scaffolding and the building, and to be willing, when the scaffolding has done its work, to let it come down so that what it was built around can finally be seen. Here is what Meister Eckhart asks of you practically, today. First, find one thing you are holding too tightly and practice releasing it, not the relationship, not the work, not the thing that genuinely requires your care and attention, the identity. The specific, constructed, carefully maintained version of yourself that you have organized your self-presentation around, the credential, the practice, the achievement, the spiritual framework, and that you have been carrying not as an instrument but as proof. Hold it for one moment as if it were not you, as if it were something you had picked up along the way and could set down without ceasing to be the person who picked it up, not permanently, not dramatically, for long enough to feel the difference between the self that is holding the thing and the thing being held. Eckhart calls this the beginning of detachment, not indifference. He is precise about this distinction. Detachment is not the absence of care. It is the freedom of a person whose care is genuine rather than anxious, who can love the thing fully precisely because they are not clinging to it, who can hold it with the open hand rather than the closed fist. Second, spend time in what Eckhart calls the desert. The silence that is not productive, the sitting that is not meditation as achievement, not the mindfulness practice that produces the measurable benefit and the identity of the person who meditates. The silence that has no agenda. That asks nothing of you. That simply is empty, still, without the content that the seeking self keeps generating to fill it. This is what Eckhart means by the desert of the Godhead. Not the absence of God, but the absence of the concept of God, the silence before the naming, the stillness beneath the activity, the ground that is always present and that the activity of seeking keeps with the best intentions covering over. 5 minutes. Not as a practice to be achieved, but as the deliberate, specific, Eckhart-prescribed setting down of everything. The seeking, the acquiring, the constructing of the self for long enough that the ground can make itself felt. Not as an experience you can report. As the recognition of something that was always there, that the noise was covering, that the silence briefly and without drama allows you to notice. Third, let one belief become a question. Eckhart was a theologian. He knew the doctrines. He had spent decades mastering the framework, and he held the framework with the specific lightness of a person who understood that the framework was pointing at something the framework could not contain. That the most rigorous theology eventually reaches the edge of what theology can do, and that the person who cannot step beyond the edge into the unknowing, who cannot hold the belief with enough openness that it becomes a question, has stopped at the threshold. Take one thing you believe about the ultimate, about God, about meaning, about the nature of reality or the purpose of existence, that you hold with certainty, and for one day hold it as a question instead, not as a doubting. As the Eckhart prescribed opening, the willingness to not know, which he called the highest knowledge, because not knowing is the condition in which the reality can instruct rather than the concept confirm. Fourth, practice what Eckhart called the birth of the Word. This is his most beautiful and most demanding teaching. The Word, the divine life, the ground of all being, is being born continuously, in every soul, in every moment, as the natural expression of the ground that the soul and God share. But the birth is prevented, he says, by the noise of the self's activity. The seeking, the constructing, the acquiring, the maintaining of the spiritual identity, all of it, however well-intentioned, fills the space in which the birth would otherwise occur naturally, as it always has been occurring beneath the noise in the ground that was never absent. The practice is not to produce the birth. You cannot produce it. The practice is to stop preventing it. To reduce the noise, the inner commentary, the self-monitoring, the constant low-grade activity of a self that is always in the process of constructing and maintaining itself enough that the ground can be heard. Not achieved, heard. The way you hear music that was playing before you stopped talking, that was always there, that the talking was covering. That is the practice, not the acquisition of a new spiritual framework to add to the existing ones. The releasing specific, quiet, daily, available, of enough of the grasping self that the thing it was always grasping toward can, in the space the releasing creates, simply be. I want to close with the image I keep returning to when I think about Meister Eckhart. Not the trial, not the condemnation, not the inquisitors who found his sermons alarming. The marketplace. The Rhineland towns where he preached to ordinary people, merchants and craftsmen and women who had no Latin, no theological training, no access to the university arguments that occupied the other intellectuals of his age. He came to them. He spoke in their language, and he said, to people who had been told that God was distant and hierarchical and approachable only through the correct institutional procedures correctly applied, he said that the ground of God and the ground of the soul are one ground. that the encounter with the divine is not a reward for the correctly performed procedure. It is the recognition of what is always already present, and that the only thing standing between you and that recognition is the grasping self that keeps seeking it. He told them to let go, not of the faith, not of the love, not of the genuine orientation toward what matters, of the concept, of the image, of the God that the seeking had produced, which was always a beginning and never a destination, of the self that had been doing the seeking, which was always a vehicle and never the ground. The ground is still here. It was always here. It is, Eckhart would say, the most intimate thing there is, closer than the self that is looking for it, deeper than the seeking that is trying to find it. And the only movement toward it is the movement that feels to the seeking self like stillness, the releasing, the letting go. The prayer that asks not for more but for less, that asks, in its deepest form, to be rid of the very thing you have been building toward, so that what was behind it all along can finally, in the emptiness that has always been its home, be found. Here is the question Meister Eckhart leaves us with today, not from the university lecture or the Dominican pulpit or the papal court, from the ground, from the silence beneath the seeking, from the place that is always present, that the activity of the spiritual life keeps covering, that the letting go reveals. What are you holding that you have mistaken for what you are seeking? What concept, what identity, what carefully constructed version of yourself or your practice or your understanding of what ultimately matters has become the thing standing between you and the thing it was always pointing at? And what would it mean, not as a dramatic act, not as a renunciation, but as the quiet, available daily practice of the open hand rather than the closed fist, to hold it lightly enough to let it go? Leave that in the comments, because naming the holding is the beginning of the releasing. And the releasing, Eckhart spent his life saying, is the beginning of the only kind of finding that the ground has always been waiting to give you. I'll see you in the next one.